This episode is brought to you by Indie Film Hustle TV, the world's first streaming service dedicated to filmmakers, screenwriters, and content creators. Learn more at indiefilmhustle.tv.
I'm sitting there in 1989 making my first, I had made one feature before and a bunch of shorts, but I'm like, okay, I can do a no budget feature. But at that point, I'm thinking.
So, because Katie, you were with Rick when you guys were working. I mean, Rick, you were making Slacker and Katie was around at that same time, correct?
I first met Katie, I kind of was finishing it.
Okay.
You know, just right at you're with me at those first premieres, and yeah. So.
You've been friends ever since?
Yes.
Yes.
We have.
So let me ask you a question, Rick. What for so many filmmakers coming up, especially of that magical time, which is the early 90s, which is kind of like the birth of independent film as we know it today. You know, I mean, yes, there was, you know, prior to Slacker, obviously there was a month, you know, and Easy Rider and things like that. But the whole Sundance, you know, for lack of a better term, kind of like the lottery ticket kind of filmmakers, like the Kevin Smiths and the Roberts and those kind of times. You were one of the first to come out in the early 90s. A lot of them look back at you. Like I just had Edward Burns on the show the other day, and he was talking about, it was Slacker. I saw the breakdown of the budget of Slacker, and it gave me hope that like, oh, I could do it. There's someone else who did it. So you're like, you broke the 4-minute mile, essentially, for a lot of filmmakers of that generation.
Yeah, you know, I think that perpetuates itself because I'm sitting there in 1989 making my first, I had made one feature before and a bunch of shorts, but I'm like, okay, I can do a no budget feature. But at that point, I'm thinking, you know, I was coming off, there was an 80s paradigm too. Mm-hmm. It wasn't Sundance based. I think that's really the difference between the generations. It didn't have Sundance as a launch. It was just indie films, you know, John Sayles.
Right.
Wayne Wang's Chan is Missing. There were all these like 20 Eagle Pinnell's a Texas filmmaker Katie worked with, and I knew just to make the low budget, backyard, no budget, personal movie. That was a really kind of a archetype in indie filmmaking. Still is, you know. That's what you can do. You make what you know, and it's kind of interesting, and that's what I felt I was doing. But at the time, I guess it was sort of unique to Austin that did mostly like horror films and things like that.
Right.
But it wasn't unique to cinema. You know, Shirley Clark had done it, and it had been happening in the 60s, the 50s. You know, there's a nice history of indie cinema. It just didn't really, it was gaining more traction as a business, it had an outlet. There were these indie theater. There was a lot of festivals springing up. You know, cable and, you know, VHS tape, you know, there was an economy around it. So in the 60s, when you made your indie film, you showed it at the few film festivals. You played it at, you know, Jonas Mekas played it in New York, and they showed it at Berkeley and a few other. It was a real scrounge around thing. You know, Cassavetes would hire a bunch of young, hungry future distributors and like, hey, we're going to distribute this film. We're going to get it out there, you know. So it was just, by the time I felt I came along and got lucky enough to get one of those distributors, the path was sort of, it had already been, it was out there. I was just like I was a 90s version of that.
Right. And you,
yeah.
But when you submitted Slacker to Sundance, it got rejected, right? The first time.
Yeah, the first year, 1990. Remember that, Katie? Because we got, and it wasn't quite finished, you know, when I got it there, but I was still disappointed. But, you know, came back the next year. In the meantime, I'd had a very interesting year with it. You know, showed it in Berlin in the marketplace to 4 people.
Stop right there. How did that work?
Seattle was a good festival.
But when you
Oh yeah.
When you guys Seattle was a real breaking festival because we were standing outside watching all these people going in, and we were like, they're coming to see Slacker? They're like, yeah, it's sold out. Like,
here's
what?
the difference. We're in Seattle in summer of 1990, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what does it look like? It looks like everybody in the film.
Yeah.
You know, everybody in line looked like they could have stepped out of the film. It was this perfect match.
Yeah, you were preaching to the choir.
I know. It was a first really great response.
That really was.
I had actually premiered it in Dallas. There was a thing called the USA Film Festival.
Yeah.
And Peterson.
I got some really dismissive. I remember waking up that morning to some really dismissive, like, this might have been a good short, but it's a bunch of Austin people not doing anything. You know, I read these my first reviews ever for something I'd worked so hard on. It was just these total, like, reviews from Dallas. And then I think, God, do I even go to the screening? I was so like, oh, they're going to hate it. I'm in Dallas. You know, they're just
but it was great.
But we did have a very good audience response.
Yeah, they totally got it.
Yeah, so that was encouraging. But,
and remember Dennis Hopper was there? And
that was a really fun festival.
You're like, that's Kit Carson. Yeah.
Yeah, because
meeting Sam Arkoff. Remember they were featured, the great Sam.
Terrible name. Mars Needs Women. Now that's $1 million title, $30,000 movie.
Yeah, he was like, kid. Yeah, it was just cool. All these, you start meeting people, you're just so enthralled with meeting film history. Sam Arkoff. Oh yeah, what do you got a film here? What's your name? What's the title? That's Slacker. Oh, bad title. You got to have, like, How to Stuff a Wild Bikini. Now that's a title.
That's a title.
That's selling foreign.
$1 million title.
$30,000
movie. Yeah, like.
And obviously you've been stuffing bikinis ever since in your career, and both of you guys ever since. That's all you do.
Mars Needs Women.
Mars Needs
That's
Women.
the title. Yeah. Because I remember watching all those movies on TV growing up, and you're meeting these guys behind it. He's like, we would have the poster made before we even did the movie just to see if it worked, if we could sell it. And I go, there's a genius there. Studios should do that. You know, I've made enough movies where they go, oh, we don't know how to market this. It's like, well, maybe we should have done all that before. You know, if no one wants to see a movie called this that looks like this, I mean, I'm glad I got to make it, but you only have yourselves to blame. Do what Sam Arkoff did.
Roger Corman. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, he's the king without question.
Boondock Saints gets made right now. Find somebody to pay the 100%, or we chop Harvey down in some way, but this movie gets made and this young writer-director gets out there.
You get Boondocks back from the man who shall not be named, Voldemort. Let's call him Voldemort.
Valdestein.
Valdestein. So you get your script back eventually, and then you get it released. So tell the story of how it actually gets made.
Oh man, yeah. Now you're hitting on some secrets that I've kept for 25 years, dude.
Okay.
So exclusive shit I shouldn't say. Number 2. Got the documentary out of me. Now you're gonna get some weird. All right, I'm not gonna give you all of it, but I'll give you a couple of.
As much or as little as you want, brother.
When we came to blows, me and Harvey just disagreed on things, and he's like, "All right, that's it. You're in turnaround now. You know what it is." But for the viewers out there that don't, that means that if Harvey has, say, bought your script, $350,000, paid a couple of your producers, done maybe one location scout, say he's in it $1 million. What turnaround is that you put it like a yard sale. You put it back out for sale. You know, this script that was highly desirable by the industry, and you try to recoup some of your money. About the most anyone gets in a turnaround situation is 50%, half their investment. Mm-hmm. So Harvey puts it in turnaround. Lo and behold, this other company wants to do it, a new company, a new guy, and he charges 100% in a turnaround situation. I was friends at the time with a guy named Oral Rifkin, who was the president of William Morris, and a friend. I got to tell you about going up to his house one day. It was unbelievable, too.
I'm sure it was.
About a young man's ego soaring. I was like, this guy had guard dogs that responded to German. It was amazing.
It was like True Lies. It was like the beginning. It was like the opening of True Lies. Got it.
Right. So he was like, I really looked up to Arnold, and he gets super pissed. Like Harvey Weinstein will not be treating our clients like this. So he puts his whole company on red alert. Boondock Saints gets made right now. Find somebody to pay the 100%, or we chop Harvey down in some way, but this movie gets made and this young writer-director gets out there.
Wow.
Because when you're putting turnaround, by the way, that's
death.
You're somebody's. I am now the black sheep of Miramax. No one wants to touch me. Certain things are already known about me in the industry. The sort of yay Troy thing is going downhill at this point, and this couldn't have happened at a worse time. It's the first real tragedy that I absorbed in the business, right? So on comes one of my favorite human beings in the world, Cassian Elwes, who was the president of Independent Film Financing over there at William Morris. He's actually Carrie Elwes's brother from Men in Tights. And,
well, Princess Bride, Saw, but you chose Men in Tights. That's fine.
What does it say about you?
I mean, Carrie's done. He's done a couple things. I'm just saying.
Yeah. So Cassian he's about the greatest guy in the world. Mm-hmm. So he finds this company will come in. They're going to pay the 100% a turnaround situation. Wow. And it's the first time Rifkin said, all my years in this business, I've never seen this happen. And clearly, Harvey does not want this movie being made for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. He doesn't want it becoming successful when he's writing you off as a mistake and trying to make everyone forget that this even happened. Mm-hmm. Cut to get the thing made. I get a bottle of champagne and a note from Harvey on the first day of principal, which I completely mistake as genuine, but it was just a gangster tactic.
It was to screw you up on your day one. Yeah, that's all it was.
Yeah, it was like the gangster walking you to say, "Hey, you're doing a good job. We're liking what we're saying. We're like, yeah."
Here's a fish.
Here's a fish in newspaper. Don't read into it. So I get the movie made, and we're going to spare you some of the other stories, but there was some quite obvious things that happened once I tried to get my little movie out there, where roadblocks were, inexplicably being thrown up in front of this film, and I had people from this industry calling me, telling me that they had been straight up intimidated either by him personally or people, representatives from his company. Wow. And so there was this campaign to then, when the movie got made, to end it and have no one see it. Strangely enough, though, and here's the fucked up part of this, he wasn't able to. When you make a movie like that the kids are going to find, it's going to happen no matter what. The thing that really screwed us at the time was a whole nother deal. It was 2 weeks before we were having our screenings for the industry, and that's where you take your little movie. You go to the big lots, Sony, Paramount, Fox. We went to all of them, and you have screenings for all them and their buyers, and all buyers from all over the place. And so you got packed. We were having packed screenings, 300-400 people. Almost no one was leaving, which always happens in these types of screenings. But you're basically asking somebody, buy my film and distribute it through your engine, your network. And Columbine happened, and I don't know if you remember, right the fuck there, like it was on cue. We're having screenings that are off the charts, and
people are loving it, and then
nobody coming forward. We were reading the kind of writing in the sand. Finally, this one buyer comes up to us and says, congratulations. He's highly complimented. Congratulations, you made a great movie. And he very, very nice about it. He said, you've been blacklisted from U.S. screens. Nobody is going to theatrically release this movie, so you got to put it on video. And that was just like dun dun dun. We were all talk about trying to find your answer in the bottom of a beer glass. We just, everybody, how hard we had worked, and this thing that happened had nothing to do with us. But all the touchstones in it, people in trench coats did this. I had two guys. It was two young men that did the violence. I had two young men, and it was just all the parallels were ridiculous. And it was exactly what they were stopping production on and pulling out of theaters right there. And Clinton landed here and had a whole talk with the industry, and they reacted that way. You just stop production on anything with violence in it right now, especially youthful violence. Pull anything with violence out of theaters. They even started in with video games. And I was right there with my little film going, please help me. And we just got screwed. But, fun story, Boondock was about to touch the public for the first time, right? And I was in the darkest depression ever because I'm like, it doesn't matter now. No theatrical release. There's no way this film's going to be successful. So I meet this guy, Dean Wilson, who remained one of my dearest friends and contacts in this business until his death a couple of years ago. Dean was the CFO of Blockbuster. And they had 7,500 stores. That was during the biggest. They were huge. They were home video for every studio, and they had a lot of power. So I take him down. It was me and Flannery, and a couple. I think maybe even Norm was there. We take him down to Photochem and arrange a screening for him to see the film. I remember because I'd already seen it a million times. I fell asleep in the only thing that I had bought with my newfound riches, which was a 68 Chevelle, fire engine red with tinted windows, badass car. I get a knock on the window, and here's this excited guy, Dean Wilson, right? And he's like, "Oh my God, that's great." He goes, "We're gonna release this and make a deal for you to be a Blockbuster exclusive." I didn't know what that was at the time, but what they were doing was taking smaller films that they felt should have been theatrical released, or that they thought would really touch their public, and release them in Blockbuster stores like they were big films. Instead of 2 copies per store, there was 60 or 120, depending on the size of the store. So Boondock was released on video as if it was some big theatrical success. And I remember walking through my local Blockbuster store and just seeing shelves and shelves of Boondock Saints. At that time, videotapes. It was VHS at first, and this was right during the crossover of DVD was beginning. So I was like, all right, make the deal. So they made the deal, right? And come to find out later on that it was Blockbuster's highest grossing straight-to-video hit in their history. Now, something I always kidded Dean about was Blockbuster had the opportunity to buy the home video rights for $150,000, slightly after he saw how well it was doing. It made some ridiculous amount in 6 months, like $12 million.
You mean as part of the deal, and it's like it was a.
We're going to take the deal was we're going to do an exclusive Blockbuster video window. We'll pay you this much and share this much of the profits with you. And they were like, all right. You want all the video rights too, so you can sell all VHS, not just rental deal, but like you can sell all the VHS and DVDs that are going to come out because of this for $150,000. If he had taken that deal, I remember just lighting into him once when we were at dinner. He took me to dinner to meet Charlie Icahn. It was the best. It was the best. And I was like, you guys had the opportunity to buy that for $150,000. And in front of Charlie Icahn, I went, you would have made $150 million if you had done that. And by the way, by that time, the numbers were in. So that wasn't a joke. And Dean was like, thanks. I took you to meet Charlie Icahn. You're the most embarrassing goddamn thing I've ever done.
It's kind of like
nobody would have seen it if it wasn't for this guy. So I owed him everything.
Right. It's kind of like when Fox gave Lucas the sequel rights and the merchandising rights for Star Wars.
Yeah. Similar. I can't tell you how many times people have compared me to George Lucas there, but let me show you how not. George Lucas was smart.
Right.
Just angry. At one point, I want the merchandising rights, and they were like, you're making a $6 million film. Who do you think's going to buy a T-shirt? Right. So it was the easiest thing in the world to shut me up, to give me the merchandising rights. And that ended up being saving my bacon in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so the movie comes out. It's a huge success. Everybody sees it because and for people who don't understand Blockbuster in 2001, 2002, 2003, in that world, they were at the height of their.
It was 2000. It was released in 2000 Blockbuster, and you're right. It became a huge hit.
Huge.
And apparently no one noticed except the people at Blockbuster and the fans. When a movie does that kind of business, just think about a company owing on 10 other movies that maybe did not do, didn't even recoup. There's all kinds of problems that can happen. And we got into this area where, from the industry, what we were being told was it's not a success. Nothing. You got nothing. I got a contract that says I'm owed money here. No, it didn't do well. And I remember going to a gas station one day and seeing my first kid with the fucking tattoos for my movie on it. And I just, I'm looking, I didn't say anything to him, and I start noticing in public, I'm at bars, and suddenly people will pop off lines from my movie while they're screwing around with each other at a pool table. So it was hard for me to believe that it wasn't doing well when I was seeing it in my own life just randomly, So we ended up, cut 2 years later, had a big lawsuit, settled that all out, got the sequel rights, and went forward with that. Which we may have to piece this into 2 interviews, bro. Too much out of me, but yeah, it became extremely successful.
But so in other words, Hollywood accounting took over, is what you're saying.
In a lot of ways, there's a lot I can't say because it's
fair enough. Fair enough.
But yeah, the old adage of you must have heard it too. You get fucked on your first one.
Yeah. You're never going to make money on your first one. That's just. It's the sequel. That's where the money is.
Yeah, and that, that happened too.
And to be fair, George, as well, on the first one, financially didn't do well on the movie. The merchandise he did okay, but the movie he didn't do well. But Empire, that's where he started really making his money. So same thing. So you go through this process. The movie gets out. You get the rights back, and now you own and control the sequel rights to Boondock, right? At this point, well, you got the rights back at least.
Yeah. We got the right because the sequel rights were wrapped into this company and this lawsuit we were in. So once that was settled, we got our sequel rights, and we were able to do 2. And within 48 hours of the conclusion of that, of those legal troubles, we had a deal for 2 on the table with Sony.
And then that went. I remember reading, because I followed you over the years. I was like, what happened to Troy? What happened to Boo? So I'd always read whatever was out, and some things. So when the sequel came out, I was reading how'd he do, what's going on, and from what I understood, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the merchandising rights, that's it's like George says, the money's in the launch boxes, idiots.
Yeah, did well, and it still is, but with the sequel, that's made a metric ton of money and done very, very well and continues to. Cult classic is about the coolest 2 words in film, and I wasn't the first to say that. There was a whole bunch of other people that did, and that's what I've done, and I'm extremely grateful to all those long-suffering fans. Because, if you think about it, they're going to be waiting 10 years between 1 and 2 and another 10 between 2 and 3. Yeah. It sucks, but,
you're like the Kubrick of indie films. Like, he does one movie every 10 years. It's fantastic.
Yeah. I'm like Lucas and Kubrick, just not half as talented or wealthy.
Exactly. It's just like them, but completely different.
Was to shoot a trailer as if it was a finished movie and use that trailer to show it to, dentist investing clubs and doctor investing clubs and rich friends of your parents or whatever, because no one can read a script and say, oh yeah, I've never worked on I'm a dentist, but I'm reading the script and I think it sounds like a good movie. And also, Joel and Ethan had never done anything. So how do you know if they're any good? But by having this trailer.
How did you go from your porno experience to getting involved with the Coen Brothers?
Right.
Did they see your porno work and say, "Hey, Barry"?
I don't think anyone saw it. I don't know what. I never tracked
Followed
that
up.
down.
Yeah.
Again, it has to do with me owning a 16 millimeter camera. I was at a party, a Christmas party with people I didn't know. I knew the hostess, but that was it. And there was one guy across the room who seemed to not be friends with everyone. A tall guy that kind of looked like Howard Stern, and that was Joe Coen.
Right.
And we started to talk because we were the only guys not talking to anyone else. And he had gone to NYU undergraduate school, but I didn't know him at all from there. And he and his brother Ethan had just written the screenplay for Blood Simple. And Joel was the assistant editor on Evil Dead. Mm-hmm. Sam Raimi's first movie, and Sam told Joel that the way to raise money to make an independent film was to shoot a trailer as if it was a finished movie and use that trailer to show it to, dentist investing clubs and doctor investing clubs and rich friends of your parents or whatever, because no one can read a script and say, oh yeah, I've never worked on I'm a dentist, but I'm reading the script and I think it sounds like a good movie. And also, Joel and Ethan had never done anything. So how do you know if they're any good? But by having this trailer, the dentists, the doctors, the inventors, the businessmen could look at the trailer and go, A, I'd go see this movie. B, this trailer looks really cool. C, you guys seem to know what you're doing. So Joel said, we're going to shoot a trailer of the script we wrote and see if we can raise money. And I said, well, I own a 16 millimeter camera. And he said, okay, you're hired to shoot the trailer, not the feature. So we shot the trailer and it looked great and we got along great. And it took us a year. Joel went out to Minneapolis where they grew up and hit all the Hadassah women. That's the sort of Jewish, women's society out there. Ethan and I stayed in New York with a print and a projector, and it took us a year, but we raised the $750,000.
Wow! And
went to Austin, Texas, and the first day shooting Blood Simple was the first day that Joel, Ethan, or I had ever been on a movie set. Wow. I had never been a camera operator or a camera assistant on features. Joel had never directed anything except student films and 8 millimeter stuff with Ethan. Ethan had never produced anything. He was a statistical typist at Macy's, where you just typed invoice numbers for 8 hours a day.
Oh my God.
So I always tell people, declare what you are, and you'll find a way to make a living doing it, and that you don't need to work your way up. You should just decide, I'm a cameraman, I'm an editor. And when people say, well, how should I get started in the film business? Truthfully, the best two things where you learn the most actually is what you did, editing and writing. Mm-hmm. Those are your best ways because you learn about structure. And also the great thing about having a script is no one can take that away from you. If you want to be a director, they can always find another director. If they want to hire another editor, they can get another editor. If you have written a script and you own it, and you say, if you want this script, I have to direct it, they'll oftentimes say yes if the script is good enough, because truthfully, studios these days want first-time directors. They want to control everything. The studio does. They don't want people that have strong opinions or people they can't push around. So I think right now it's almost easier to get a job as a first-time director than someone who's been around directing for decades.
That's why. Time. Yeah, it is interesting because I think Ridley Scott came out and said, he goes, I can't believe they're giving these $200 million franchise films to a 25-year-old or a young kid, and he's very talented, or she's but it's not. It makes no sense. Why wouldn't you hire Ridley or yourself or somebody who's been down that road? And that makes absolute sense.
It's because the studios want to control everything. The studios don't really understand what directors do and think that they can do it, and that directors are like traffic cops. Mm-hmm. And, so all those Marvel movies look for first and second time directors for the most part until they're in the family. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and as of this recording, Sam Raimi just got hired to do the next Doctor Strange.
Really?
Yeah, it just got released today. The information, the news broke today. So Sam actually officially signed to do Doctor Strange, was a Master of Madness or something like that, which makes all the sense in the world because that's a perfect movie for him. Which makes sense. I wanted to ask you something in regards to Blood Simple, and I know that Sam actually, I think he was the first to do it, or at least popularize it, is putting the camera on a 2x4 and having two guys on each side just run. So you get this really insane kind of fast dolly, and then shooting the film a little faster so it would get like this revved up kind of POV. You guys did that in Blood Simple as well. How did that whole thing come around?
Well, Sam kind of invented it. It was called the shaky cam. Mm-hmm. What gives it energy actually is not undercranking it, but using an extremely wide-angle lens. You use a 9.8 millimeter, and this is 35 millimeters, so it's extremely wide angle. It probably has a angle of view of 165 degrees or something. It's almost everything, and because it moves through space and changes perspective so quickly because it's such a wide-angle lens. I mean, like, this is a wide-angle lens, so, like, look, you see both my hands, and with this tiny little move, now I'm very tight. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the nature of wide-angle lenses that a little move makes a very different move in perspective. So I'm trying to remember if we used it on Blood Simple. We used it a lot on Raising Arizona.
No, you did use it on... There is a shot in Blood Simple, I remember. That was like outside the house. It was coming toward the door or something. Yeah.
Danny Hedaya has just grabbed Fran McDormand inside the house. And we're way back on the other side of the street. And the door opens and Hedaya is bringing her towards the lens. And we race towards him. And she breaks his finger. And then kicks him in the groin, and then he bends down and throws up, which is another story. So we learned that from Sam. We use it a lot more on Raising Arizona. There's a scene where we go over a fountain, over a car, up a ladder, through a window into Florence, Arizona's mouth in this fake one continuous shot. I always say that we could Blood Simple cost $750,000. I said, we could redo that movie right now for $20 million, and it wouldn't be any better. We could reshoot Raising Arizona, which I think was $5 million. We could reshoot, maybe it was 12. No, I think it was 5. We could reshoot that for $50 million with techno cranes instead of using shaky cams. And again, it wouldn't look any better. So it's great how we're able to pull off all that stuff and make it seem professional.
Now, I remember in Blood Simple, which I think was one of the, I don't know if it was the first time, but the lighting there was a shot where there was bullet holes in the wall.
Right.
And shafts of light would come in with the smoke coming out. And I still remember going back, I don't know where I heard it, but I heard Joel Silver talking about that shot specifically. And he's like, I make action movies. Why doesn't my stuff look like that? And that's a testament, I'm assuming, to you, because you were the DP on that. Was that something from your commercial world that you kind of brought into the film world? Like, because I hadn't seen that either prior to that, like something so cinematic. Because Blood Simple it's a noir film, but it is very cinematically shot.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It's one of the shots we also did for the trailer. Because don't forget, we didn't have actors or anything. So for the trailer, it was very abstract. It was like dotted lines on the road. It was following, like a cowboy hat or following like someone's boots, an insert of a gun. And in Hillary's loft, Hillary was a woman who had the Christmas party where Joel and I met. It's now 8 months later. It's now 3 weeks later. We've now built the wall in Hillary's loft, and we're shooting that shot, not the one that's in the movie, but our cheap version of it, which was we drilled these big holes, these big plugs in the wall. We literally had a wall that was probably 20 feet long by 10 feet high that we spackled and everything. We drilled these plugs out, and then we put screws in the back of the plugs, and then we replastered the wall. And then I had a lot of little inkies so I could shine all those lights in different directions, because they weren't just one light. Like every hole that opened up, there would be 3 different beams from each hole. And so I had all these inkies. I taught Ethan Coen how to be my gaffer on how to put the light bulbs in without burning himself and all that. And as I dollied into the wall, in the back, this guy, Don, was hitting the hammer to these screws, and the plug, first of all, our side of the room was pretty dark. And also the plug moved through frame so fast that it just looked like a hole opening up. Mm-hmm. And so that was in the trailer, and that's really what got us to $750,000. I heard a story that Nestor Almendros, who was a pretty famous cinematographer, and Nestor was a big believer in motivated light, which I don't believe in. Motivated light means if there's a lamp over here, that's where the main light should be from. Mm-hmm. If it's above you, it should be there. Nestor was a judge at some film festival where Blood Simple was shown. And he said, well, it's a great shot, but the light's not motivated. Because obviously in a bathroom, you wouldn't have multiple beams of light. But anyway, it worked.
It's still a cool shot. Yeah, it's still a cool shot.
Which that's one of the things I find interesting here, is that not only could I, with this book, chart the evolution of Quentin as a filmmaker, as a writer, as, a creative, but also it's interesting because we think of him as Mr. Gunn.
For those who don't know where Quentin got his start, can you kind of talk a little bit about his origins and getting into this project?
Okay, well, one of the things that the book focuses on is some of the even earlier projects that Quentin had worked on. My Best Friend's Birthday was the first one that he directed, but he'd helped out on some other films. It was basically essentially the same crew that worked on those, and so really it evolved. So he worked on, these are no budget movies, shot in people's backyards on, basically on video, and these were in the early 80s, and like there's one where, Quentin's the bad guy, and everybody talks about it, but there's no, they were like, he's great, but there's no footage left of it. And, that was, I believe, directed by Al Harrell, which is a member of that group that everybody talks about. Al's passed on now, but, and I think that was kind of a mix of, as I'm trying to remember, it was kind of like Assault on Precinct 13 meets something else. I can't even remember. But then like Quentin and I think Craig Hammond, who co-wrote My Best Friend's Birthday, were the bad guys, if I remember correctly, in that movie. And
they don't exist anymore? And they don't, none of those footage exists anymore?
No, not as far as I know. And he worked on some other stuff here and there. So he ends up getting them, well, not really even getting the money. He ends up getting the desire to make his own movie. So he talks to his friend Craig Hammond. They come up with this idea. So they're going to make a movie. They have no money. Quentin works a minimum wage job, as everybody knows, at Video Archives. And they have no money, but they have this desire. So Craig writes a script at the time for My Best Friend's Birthday, which is a very, very short script at the time. And it's a screwball comedy, which that's one of the things I find interesting here, is that not only could I, with this book, chart the evolution of Quentin as a filmmaker, as a writer, as, a creative, but also it's interesting because we think of him as Mr. Gunn. He talked about that one time. Everybody thinks of me as Mr. Gunn. He either does crime or he does Western, something where, people are going to get shot and all that good stuff. But this was a screwball comedy. So Craig writes a script. Quentin comes in and expands it somewhat, rewrites it. But then they go out and they shoot, and they have to shoot piece by piece by piece. They're out stealing shots because they can't afford, locations. They can't. And what's funny, I'm skipping around, but on the film that they shot before that, Warzone, there was a time when that's detailed in the story, in the book, and it's very funny, where they were stealing shots. And so they all have these guns, and they're, supposed to be tough guys, and there's a motorcycle, and the cops show up and aim their guns at everybody and make them lay down on the ground. And what's really funny, and this is the great part about an oral history, where it's all told in the dialogue, is that some of the people are like, like Quentin's like, we weren't scared at all. And then someone else is like, we were all crying. And, and it's just this completely different, these different takes on it. And an oral history is great because it gives you this Rashomon kind of story where you have all these different perspectives, which are different generally, even if it's something that just happened. But when you take a story that happened in the 1980s and you tell it, you're going to get different versions of that. So anyway, they're making My Best Friend's Birthday on Quentin's minimum wage salary, which
on
is
film.
insane.
On film.
Right. On film, yes. They're shooting this one on film. And so they're just shooting it little by little over time. I guess a lot of the scenes, they end up improvising, or they take a nugget of what was in the script and they come up with something new. So at the time, Quentin's acting teacher was Alan Garfield, who's in a lot of great films like The Stunt Man and, things like Beverly Hills Cop 2, all kinds of stuff. And so he gets Alan Garfield to do a scene. He gets Brenda Hillhouse, who was one of his acting teachers from his first acting school, to come and do this scene with Alan Garfield. And Brenda, people will remember from Dusk Till Dawn. She's the one that they kidnap, and Richie kind of gets a little creepy with her. And, when George Clooney's Seth comes back, there's blood everywhere. And that's what's left of Brenda.
Yeah.
She's also in his ER episode, and she's the mother of little Butch in the famous Christopher Walken I Had a Watch in My Ass scene.
Yeah.
And so anyway, he gets these. This is one of the most telling representative scenes of how they had to shoot with no budget. So they needed, for this scene, there's a bakery, but they don't have a bakery. So they shoot it in video archives when nobody's around. So then it becomes a video store / bakery, which, no, that doesn't make any sense, but it's funny because, and I've worked on microfilms. I've worked on some shitty trauma movies, and, this is a thing. You have to, adapt, improvise, make these things work. And not only that, but they made Alan Garfield's character named Bill Smith after William Smith, the great actor, who was and he was in on one of our movies, but he was one of Quentin's favorite actors. So it becomes Bill Smith's video store / bakery. And, and they do this scene, and again, kind of representative. So Alan Garfield brings his dog. And Quentin's quote that he tells me for the book was, he's one of those guys. He's one of those, bring your puppy around, those guys. And Quentin says it very respectfully because he loved Alan Garfield, but the dog gets into the case and eats the cake while they're doing the dialogue scene. Then when they need the cake's eaten by the dog. And I mean, it's just a kind of a comedy of errors.
Now you interviewed you actually interviewed Quentin for part of this book?
Oh, yeah. I had tried to interview Quentin for years. I met him in 1999 at when he used to do the film festivals in Austin at Rick Linklater's thing there at the First Alamo Draft House. And I was working on my first book was supposed to be about Quentin. And I think I kind of scared Quentin away at that time because Jamie Bernard was writing the intro, and Quentin had a falling out with Jamie Bernard, who wrote his first biography. So I kind of think what happened was he associated me with her, and he didn't want to be involved. He was very nice, but all of a sudden people were calling back saying, I'm not supposed to talk to you. And so I knew kind of what was going on. I kept working on the book on and off, did more books. I mean, I've got 46 books out this year, I think. And
God bless you.
I don't have life otherwise. But so anyway, and I was going to do this book on all of Quentin's films, because at the time I started, there were two biographies. There was one by Winsley Clarkson, and there was the one by Jamie Bernard. But I wanted to do a kind of a companion to the films, which is funny now to think, because I started that in 1997 when all there was, that he directed was Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown. Right. But then, I was also going into True Romance, Natural Born Killers, Natural Born Killers, and, and, From Dusk Till Dawn and True Romance. So anyway, I worked on this book on and off for a million years. I pick up this book called Quentin Tarantino FAQ. Well, it's the same book. So I ended up just throwing that book out, and I took the interviews I had done with a lot of cool people like Monty Hellman and Roger Avery, Tom Savini. I went ahead and I put it out a few years ago. That was my first book on Tarantino. So that's called Conversations on Quentin Tarantino.
Right.
That came out in, I think, 2015, 2016.
Now,
so I kept trudging forward, and somehow it all came together, man.
So, all right, so they're starting to shoot this thing, and from my understanding, the lore is that they shot this over like a year or something like that, or more.
It was several years. I don't remember specifically.
It was a while. It was like on the weekends, whenever they can like grab enough money to buy some film stock or some short ends to go shoot this thing.
Right. Well, and people's hair would change.
Right.
It would become longer, shorter, longer. All of these different things. The lead actress, she moved away, and then they had to have her come. She was teaching. They had to have her come back. So
I've heard this story 1,000 times from so many filmmakers that I've interviewed over the years, but hearing it that Quentin Tarantino started like that is so much fun, because in so many ways, Quentin is arguably one of these mythical filmmakers. He's one of he's one of the most interesting filmmakers of his generation, let alone in all of film history. So he's almost at that kind of like Mount Hollywood, a god on Mount Hollywood. But to know that he started like us mortals, it's interesting too. It's always interesting to see how they got started, because most people just think he just showed up with Reservoir Dogs and exploded, and that was the end of it. But it took a while to get there. Now, when he was putting this all together, so they basically were financing this through Quentin's minimum wage job at a video store.
Right. And I think some of the other people would occasionally chip in money, but it was pretty much just with his minimum wage job.
And who
have to save up for a month or two to be able to rent the camera for a night. Then they'd shoot for 24 hours straight, whatever they could write, and on short ends. And
right. And how did they edit this? Were they editing this on flatbed?
Well, that's part of the problem. So Quentin waits a long time to edit it, because they had to hire somebody to edit. So they hire somebody to help edit at one point, but that didn't really work out well. Quentin ends up renting a flatbed and finding out eventually that the movie wasn't what he thought it was. And that's kind of we'll get there, I'm sure, but that's sort of the story of where the movie ends up being. I wanted to say two things about this book. One, I thought it was important because I wanted to show the evolution of him as a filmmaker. Mm-hmm. People think, as you said, that somebody that's that gifted just evolves from they just pop out of the womb and they're fully formed. And that's not the case, with anybody. I had seen, there was a lot of talk about Stanley Kubrick's first film.
Mm-hmm. Fear Desire. Yeah. Right.
And, and Stanley tried to suppress that coming out later on. But it's important because, again, it's a documentation of his, it doesn't take away from the things he did later on. No. It only helps us to see his evolution as an artist. And so there was a time I tried to get Quentin for this book. Couldn't get him. made my last plea, and I said, I think you probably want to suppress this, but you shouldn't, and here's why, yada, yada, yada. But it was interesting when I interviewed him, he said, no, I don't want to suppress this. Quentin still loves this movie. He knows it's problematic, but he loves it, and he still has most of it. The other thing I wanted to get to was what this book is really about. Because people think, well, how can a whole book just be about this movie? And that's true. So what this book actually is it in 3 parts. The first part is sort of the biggest thing we've seen on Quentin's life and all of those people in his sphere leading up to my best friend's birthday. It's called, I think it's been a while since I wrote it. I think it's something like The Players Come Together. Mm-hmm. And what it is, it's, again, the most detailed look at video archives, all of that. Roger Avery, and, I interviewed all of these people for the book, including Avery, whom I've interviewed several times. And it's a really cool book, but it shows how they all met and then, how they get to a place where they're going to make movies. Then the second part is them making movies. So it starts out with all of the little movies they work on and how they get to my best friend's birthday. And then kind of just a blow by blow of, as best anybody can reassemble, what that shoot was like, as told by Craig Hammond, Quentin Tarantino, Roger Avery, and all of the cast that was still alive that I could find. And then the third part looks at the existing script, and it kind of, with some running commentary, and it kind of shows us what that movie might have been. Now, it's important to point out the script that is floating around, everybody always thinks when they find it, oh, I found the script, but the script that's floating around is not actually the script. It's the closest facsimile there is. But what it actually is when later on when Craig Hammond optioned the screenplay to Don Murphy, which is a whole other mess that a lot of us probably know parts of. And this book details that.
Well, so what was that? So they optioned this script to somebody else?
Well, what happened was Don Murphy, who was Quentin's enemy, who was the producer of Natural Born Killers, they had that big falling out over Natural Born Killers. He's the guy that Quentin, quote unquote, bitch slapped in a restaurant, and it ended up in a big lawsuit. So
Don Murphy Don Murphy bitch slapped Quentin?
Quentin bitch slapped Don Murphy.
That makes more sense.
What everybody's consensus is that the main reason Don Murphy wanted to option this script was to piss Quentin off. So he goes to Quentin's old writing partner, who loves Quentin to this day and never wanted to screw Quentin over. But he went to him and he dangled money over his head. And Craig thought this was going to be great for everybody. He thought it was going to be great for him and Quentin. And it really didn't work out that way. Quentin blew up and, they got into a fight. And that's documented in the book too, but in everybody's words. But at that time, what Craig did was essentially take all of the things that they had improvised and wrote them into script form also. So it becomes this script that is sort of kind of a weird bastardization of all of the forms of script that had existed and also the improvised scenes, and with Craig actually writing little things to kind of link some of the scenes together that there was no link for, because there were things that they ended up shooting that weren't in the original script. So it's kind of it's interesting to imagine what might have been, but we don't fully know what might have been. But then eventually, obviously, Don Murphy did. So Don Murphy did get the rights to the script. He did, and there was a time when I knew Don a little, and I had asked him about the script, and he pretty much just admitted. I don't remember what his words are, and I don't want to get sued because he is a litigious guy, but he basically admitted to the effect that was why he optioned it. He had said that it was never going to get made, and I think it was known from the beginning it wasn't really going to get made.
I think a lot of people react to it because it becomes the sort of the movie that sort of represents
and arguably Chasing Amy is one of my favorite of the filmography of what you and Kevin have done. There's so much heart, so much authenticity in that film. It's not nearly as silly as Mallrats in the crudeness of it, but there still is those elements. But there's so much more heart in Chasing Amy. Like it's deeper in a way. Am I wrong on that?
No. I mean, I think Chasing Amy becomes the sort of. I think a lot of people react to it because it becomes the sort of the movie that sort of represents kind of more the totality of who Kevin is, right? So it's like the crude humor, of course, is part of it, but it's like, he's also he's a dramatist. He's also somebody who's like has a big heart, and it's also a personal movie. It's a personal movie for him, and I think that sort of shifts. Sort of Clark's and Mallrats, and this becomes something where he's like, all right, I'm going to tell another personal story, which just happens to be more grounded in there's a lot more drama and real drama, right? So it's like sort of drama stemming from this specific situation. But I think it became like, and that was a year later. So Mallrats comes out in 95, 96, like February or something. We start shooting Chasing Amy, February or March. And then January 97, we're in Sundance, and we're back,
We're back, baby. And we're back. And that does gangbusters at the box office, especially for its budget, and launches this little known actor, really, Ben Affleck, which is his first starring role, and that whole thing. So it was just an exciting time because I was following you guys, like I was following you and Robert and Quentin and all that, that crew and Richard and all that crew. I would watch every damn thing you guys put out. And it was that weird time. And I always tell people this, like the 90s, it felt like every month there was a new Cinderella story. It's either John Singleton, it's Ed Burns, it's Kevin Smith. It was like it was an amazing time to be an independent filmmaker. It was kind of like when Spielberg and Lucas and Milius and Coppola and De Palma, that film school brats generation, when they were kind of given the keys to Hollywood because Hollywood had no idea what the hell to do. So they're like, here, go make Taxi Driver. And you guys kind of had that run in the 90s. It was that from like 89 to like 98, 99, there was that run that was just so many amazing filmmakers came out during that time.
I mean, I think there's, I'm sure someone's read a book about it, but I feel like, part of it is like the industry sort of needs to open, it's sort of like, especially then, it's like nowadays it feels like there's a lot of venues and ways to get things made. And back then it was like, it was just harder to get things made because there weren't as many outlets. But you also see the surge of, Fox Searchlight. So there's more sort of like, there's more outlets for these movies. There's more opportunities, but also it felt like like in the 70s, the business was kind of like, how do we make money? Yeah. Like, what do audiences want? Like, there's also a generational thing to me, which is like the industry has to open its doors every once in a while to let in the new generation of voices that they don't necessarily understand. Like what was happening in the 70s. It's like, it's not like those guys who were making movies in the 50s and 60s necessarily understood like that the audience wanted to see Easy Rider, right? Like,
right. Easy Rider kind of opened the door for all those guys. So like they said, wait a minute, this $200 and something thousand movie went on and made like, $10 million or whatever it made. They were just like, we don't know what the hell's going on. Let's give it to these guys. The Scorsese and the Spielberg kid. Let's give them that shark movie.
Yeah. It's like, it just became it's like audiences change. I think it's always like some combination of, audiences are changing and younger people come up, and it's happening now. Like there's, I'm almost 50, so it's not like I'm the young buck anymore. And there's a whole generation of people coming up that have been influenced by totally different people. And, they've all had the internet since they were born. Like, all of these influences change what people's tastes. So it's like, and I think in the 90s, there was a sense of like, coming out of the 80s, it was like this need of like fresh voices and, something that was more reflective of the generation coming up.
The Gen X guys, we're Gen X guys. That generation was like, it was, the 90s were fun, man. The 90s were fun. I miss them more now than ever before. When you could just go to a movie theater, that was nice.
Yeah. Well, that was like last year.
Yeah, I know, right?
Didn't have to go all the way back to the 90s, but yeah, the 90s we had a lot. I had a lot of fun in the 90s. It's funny, no one ever talks about the 2000s.
You never hear like, oh, the 2000s music. Like, no, I know those songs and I know those films, but the 80s and 90s in the 70s, 80s, and 90s kind of get that. They have their own thing. But the 2000s is tough. And like the 2010s was another.
But is it just that it's too young?
I don't know. Oh, no, don't worry. It'll come back around. Like right now we're in our 90s nostalgia. And I think now people are starting to kick into the early 2000s. It's like a 2-decade run because remember when the 80s was like all the rage, like everything was 80s. And 80s is still cool to a certain extent. But I remember when it was 70s, like in the 90s, the 70s were kind of like a thing. And there's like a 2 to 3 decade delay.
Well, I think we're old enough where it's like at a certain point, like we're not nostalgic. Part of it is because like you and I will probably never have nostalgia for the 2000s, right? Because we were just too old. Right. Like once you hit 30 or whatever, it feels like you sort of cease being, it's like you stop like living in this, or you stop reflecting back in nostalgic terms. Like
You're right.
The 80s, I graduated from high school in '89. So the 80s was like when, the movies and music, you're sort of, what I think is like the 80s for me, the 80s and 90s was this explosion of I'm ingesting massive amounts of art in the form of movies, music, photography, like everything. Like the 80s and 90s, like I would fucking watch like 4 movies. Like when I would watch 4 movies a day.
Yep.
It's this massive period where you're taking things in, partly because, you're not great or you have an outlet to like put things out. So you're sort of like, you're amassing all this stuff. And so I think that's why it has such a strong influence on who we are. Like, I think back to the 80s and 90s and like everything I do today, it's like, it feels a little bit referential to that time, but part of it is because like, that is when the synapses were really forming around like, and these sort of large touchstones like land in your head during that period. And then by the time I get to 2000, like I don't have all these sort of cultural touchstones of like, I was listening to music and watching movies. I was doing all that stuff. And there's great movies from that period, great music and all that stuff. But it's still like, it doesn't have the same sheen to it because it wasn't during that sort of explosive period of like, getting your driver's license and kissing, like everything's new. You know what I mean?
No, you're absolutely right.
So yeah, it's funny. Like nobody was a star yet. So Jennifer had, I think it was.
Ask you though, when you jump from McMullen to She's the One, that's a slight budget difference, and also a slight cast difference as far as the prestige of the actors you were dealing with. Because I know Cameron Diaz was in it, and Jennifer Aniston was in it. Jen was just starting. Was Friends was still a thing at that point, right, or not yet?
So yeah, it's funny. Like nobody was a star yet. So Jennifer had, I think it was after the first season of Friends.
Yeah.
So, she's an actress on a sitcom. And granted, the sitcom's very successful, but it isn't like
Friends.
Whoever would have been the big, female movie star at that time.
Right.
And she came in and auditioned and was great. And, and just crushed the part. Cameron was in The Mask at that time. So again, no one, Cameron Diaz wasn't a household name by any stretch.
She's the girl from The Mask. Right.
She's the girl from The Mask. A couple of years later, Something About Mary, different deal.
Right.
But, it's interesting, like 2 actors who, an actress who kind of was the runner-up to Jennifer's part and the actress who was sort of my second choice for Cameron's part we end up casting in the movie, and that was Leslie Mann and Amanda Peet.
Mm-hmm.
Were also in that movie. So the heavy hitter that we had at the time, like the actor to be intimidated by as a really first time director, was John Mahoney.
Yeah.
You know, and I knew John Mahoney from 8 Men Out and Moonstruck.
Yeah, he's a legend. So how do you do? So as a quote unquote first time filmmaker, like in a professional environment, how do you handle dealing with obviously you didn't have any giant movie stars that you were dealing with. You had professional actors, like seasoned professional actors. How was that adjustment from no money over 12 months with short ends to now on a $3 million budget and a little bit more breathing room?
I'd say two things. One, the adjustment to working with the actors, I would say really wasn't much of an adjustment because nobody had a ton of experience. We were all the same age. You know, we're all just kids in our 20s doing it. You know what I mean? It wasn't like I was working with like Nick Nolte and, you know, like a bunch of seasoned vets. Mm-hmm. We're all like a bunch of kids making an indie movie in New York. So it was like we're just hanging out and became friends. So there was no real intimidation factor on set with the actors. Where I was truly intimidated was like walking onto set day one. We had a scene at the airport at JFK. We got half the terminal closed.
Jesus.
I show up, you know, there's 150 people there that are my crew. Now, granted, I've met my department heads. We've been through pre-production together. You know, I have good relationships with them. But when you step onto the set and 150 people look at you and you're 27 years old, and they're like, all right, what's first up? And you're like, okay.
Here we go. When the dolly grip has shot probably 70 or 80 features, and they're looking. And I had to believe when you walked in at 27, you know that some of these crew guys were like, "This son of a bitch, how did this guy get this?" And did you get that vibe on some of this stuff?
Definitely, there was probably some of that. But it's funny you mentioned the dolly grip. It was a tough old guy named Huff. Of
course, his name was Huff.
He didn't say 2 words to me for about the first 2 weeks, but eventually, you know, mm-hmm. I think I won him over.
You broke him down. I've had when I was that young directing on big sets, doing my commercials and stuff. I would the same thing, man. You would walk in and these guys were just like, "Who's this?" Yeah. Like they have to smell you for the first like half day before like, "Oh, does this guy even know what he's doing?"
But the fun thing from that is there was a PA on that film named Stuart Nicolai, and I'm 27 at the time. He's probably 23. It's his first gig in the film business out of college, and he works in the location department.
Right
now, he's been my main location scout on. You know, I did a TV show a couple of years ago called Public Morals. He did the TV show we're doing now, Bridge and Tunnel. So, you know, again, back to the relationships thing, you know, he's a PA who's my age. We become friends. You know, I ended up, you know, he worked on Sidewalks of New York. So over time, you know, as he kind of moved up the rung, he then became sort of my locations guy. So,
and you never know who you're going to meet along the way. Look at that, like the PA guy. Yeah.